The hillside trembles with the roar of 50,000 voices. At the center of it all, Gaulish warriors thrust up a grisly prize, the severed head of a Roman consul. To them, it was the sound of triumph, the symbol that Rome's fate was sealed. But history doesn't bend that easily. In the next 20 minutes, you'll see how that thunderous moment of confidence became the crack in their armor, the final nail in the coffin, the beginning of the end for GIC power in northern Italy. And you'll meet the Roman general who turned their celebration into a death sentence. Welcome to your daily history channel, Heroic History, where we bring you incredible stories of ancient warfare every single day. We're proud to be part of a growing community of history lovers. And if you love history as much as we do, hit subscribe so you never miss a battle. Let's rewind more than 2,000 years to a day that terrified Rome, the Battle of the Allia. Every Roman knew this story. It was burned into their memory like a scar that never healed. Back in 390 BC, the Gauls poured down from the north, wild-haired, painted, screaming war cries that echoed through the hills. The sun is beating down, and on the banks of a narrow river, the Roman line begins to buckle. At first, it's just a ripple of panic, one cohort faltering, a few men slipping away. Then it spreads like wildfire. Shields clatter to the ground, spears are abandoned in the mud, and the whole army dissolves into chaos. Soldiers threw down their shields, dropped their spears and bolted for the city. Some didn't even make it that far. The Gauls didn't stop. They pushed straight into Rome. Temples went up in smoke. The houses of senators and merchants alike stripped bare, and families fled into the countryside with nothing but what they could carry, a child under one arm, a bundle of food under the other. The proud city, which had stood for centuries, suddenly looked as fragile as a village of mud huts. The few defenders who remained barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, watching helplessly as flames swallowed the forum below. And when morning came, it looked like Rome was finished before it had even begun its story. The once proud city stands hollowed out, its walls smeared with smoke, its treasures piled into GIC wagons. Survival came not from strength, but from luck. A ransom of gold paid out in humiliation to buy the Gauls' withdrawal. That was the price of failure, and the memory of that shame lingered. Fathers told sons, and sons told grandsons about the day when the Gauls stood at the gates and Rome could do nothing but tremble. That memory never left them. It became a nightmare that haunted every Senate debate, every military council. The Gauls were not just another enemy. They were living proof of Rome's most vulnerable moment, a reminder that even the eternal city could crumble if its people faltered. 2 centuries later, that fear still had teeth. Every rumor of Celtic warbands on the move, every merchant caravan that swore it, saw painted warriors across the Alps, set nerves on edge. Rome could beat Carthage, outlast Samnites, and push back Etruscans. But the idea of another GIC horde pouring into the plains of northern Italy carried a special chill. So, who were these people? These Celts who stalked Roman dreams. They weren't one unified nation with kings and borders like Rome. They were a mosaic of tribes, scattered but fierce. The Boii settled in the Po Valley, the Onsubres with their strongholds near Mediolanum, and the Gassate, wild mercenaries who sold their swords to the highest bidder. The Gassate in particular left an unforgettable impression. They fought nearly naked, covered only in tattoos, charms, and raw bravado. To Romans, they looked less like soldiers and more like spirits of war, men too fearless or too reckless to even shield their own flesh. Their reasons for coming south were just as unsettling. Some came for plunder, hunting down silver goblets, jeweled brooches, and bronze statues that could be melted into raw wealth. Roman writers remembered wagons loaded with loot creaking back across the Alps after each raid. Others came with their families in tow, seeking farmland. Compared to the rocky hills and thin soil of Gaul, the plains of northern Italy were paradise, broad green valleys watered by rivers, land that could feed a tribe for generations. But above all, there was tradition. Crossing into Italy wasn't simply a campaign. It was a heritage passed from father to son. Around Celtic hearths, boys grew up hearing of the time their ancestors had brought mighty Rome to its knees, of the gold ransom paid out under the mocking eyes of Brennus. Raiding Italy became more than opportunity. It was a proving ground to cross the Alps, to test Roman strength, to carve your name in the land of vineyards and walled cities. This was almost a rite of passage for Celtic warriors. The Romans saw barbarism, the Celts saw legacy. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had clawed its way back from that old humiliation. No longer a vulnerable city-state, it had turned into a rising power. The First Punic War against Carthage had been brutal, stretching over 2 decades. But Rome emerged hardened and victorious. They had beaten one of the Mediterranean's great powers on land and at sea, something no Italian state had ever dreamed of. Their fleets now patrolled waters once ruled by Carthaginian triremes. And their legions stood bloodied, but experienced, tested by years of siege and battle. And yet, for all their victories in the south and across the seas, the north remained unsettled, almost like a wound that refused to heal. The fertile valleys of the Po were rich and inviting, but also restless and dangerous. They were the frontier where Rome's confidence met Celtic hunger. Every year brought new rumors, Gaulish warriors gathering, mercenaries streaming into Italy, tribes uniting under bold leaders. For Rome, the north was both a prize and a threat. What good was victory in Sicily or Sardinia if the gates of Italy itself stood vulnerable? The boy and the Onsubre knew this, and fear gnawed at them. They'd watched Rome expand step by step, swallowing rivals until none were left untouched. They understood what was coming. If they waited, Rome would come for their lands in turn. So they chose to strike first, to flip the script. This time wasn't just a raid for plunder, it was strategy. Hit Rome with one hard blow, shake her confidence, force her to pause and remind them who is the dominant. So the Celts came rolling down into Etruria, not a lightning raid but something larger, almost like a whole nation on the move. Wagons creaked under the weight of spoils already taken. Silver goblets, bronze statues, treasures pried from Italian towns, unlucky enough to lie in their path. But it wasn't just warriors who marched. Families came too. Children stumbled along the dusty tracks. Women drove oxen, coaxing them forward under the summer sun. The army crawled, slowed by the very weight of its success. And mile after mile, as the column wound deeper into Italy, it was exposed, vulnerable in a land where Roman armies were already moving to block their way. Into this tense landscape stepped 2 Roman consuls, the twin pillars of the Republic's yearly leadership. Every year, the Roman people elected them, and every year, those men carried both the weight of command and the burden of rivalry. For in Rome, no single general was supposed to rise too high, so power was always split in 2. On paper, they were partners. In reality, they were often competitors, each eyeing the laurels of victory that might one day crown their family name. Lucius Aemilius Pappus was the steadier of the pair. Years of hard campaigning across Italy had carved discipline into his bones. He was the kind of man who measured twice before striking once, who preferred to let rash opponents dash themselves against his patience. His soldiers respected him, if not with warmth, then with a kind of quiet trust. They knew he would not gamble their lives lightly. At his side, though not always in harmony, stood Gaius Atilius Regulus. Younger, quicker to strike, still burning from the pride of his recent campaign in Sardinia. Where Pappus measured twice, Regulus lunged once, certain that boldness itself could carry the day. He embodied the restless hunger of Roman politics, where every consul served for only a single year. Time was short, and glory had to be seized before it slipped away. For Regulus, survival wasn't enough. He wanted a triumph, a procession through the streets with his name etched forever into the marble of Rome's memory. That was the paradox of Rome's system. Equal power meant equal risk. Two commanders sharing authority could either become a double-edged sword in the Republic's hand or cut against each other when unity mattered most. Could Pappus's discipline and Regulus's ambition fuse into strength at the moment of decision? Or would ego fracture their command, opening the door to another humiliation, another fire at the gates? The test came swiftly. From the south, Pappus blocked the road. From the north, almost like fate closing its jaws, Regulus arrived with his Sardinian veterans, and in between, the Celts suddenly realized they were no longer an army marching south, but prey caught in a tightening Roman trap. The road ahead was blocked by Pappus, the road behind by Regulus, and this wasn't a raiding party that could melt back into the forests. Their wagons were heavy with plunder, their families strung along the line of march. There was no running from this, so they turned and faced it. Chiefs barked orders, warriors slammed spear butts against their shields, and in a display of raw determination, they split their host in two. One battle line braced itself against Pappus's legions, while the other swung around to meet Regulus's advance. It was a desperate solution. Survival meant breaking one Roman army before the other could close in. And then came the question, hanging heavy in the summer air: who would strike the first blow? Regulus wasted no time giving the answer. Impetuous, eager to seize the moment, he spurred his cavalry forward, aiming for a ridge that overlooked the plain. Whoever held that hill would command the field. Hooves pounded the earth, iron-shod and furious, dust rose. Shouts cut across the valley, and in a heartbeat, the calm before the storm shattered. Horses crashed into horses, steel bit against steel, and the hillside erupted in violence. Men grappled face to face, shields splintering, blades sparking, the weight of the fight pressing in so close, you could hear the breath and curses of the men locked together. And there, in the crush of bodies and iron, Gaius Atilius Regulus, consul of Rome, commander of legions, was struck down. For a heartbeat, the battlefield froze. It was as if time itself inhaled. One of Rome's supreme magistrates, one of the two highest officials of the Republic, gone in the very first collision of the battle, lay dead in the dirt. The Celts knew the value of this moment. They weren't just killing a man. They were killing a symbol. They hacked off his head, held it high, and let the blood drip down the shaft of the spear. Then they paraded it along their line, a grisly prize swaying in the sunlight. Every warrior in their ranks was shown what they had done. A consul of Rome, the embodiment of senate and people, now reduced to a severed head. To the Celts, it was more than a trophy. It was proof the gods favored them, proof that the terror of Rome could be broken like any other enemy. Each time that head passed, their voices rose, their cheers grew louder until the hills themselves seemed to echo with tribal triumph. But for the Romans who saw it, imagine standing in the ranks, shield in hand, watching your leader's head lifted high by the enemy. A consul was not just a general. He carried the authority of the Republic, the weight of centuries of tradition. His very presence told soldiers they were part of something greater, that Rome itself stood beside them. To see that symbol cut down so quickly, paraded like a cheap war trophy, it must have felt like a shiver running down the spine of the entire army. Was this the first crack in Rome's armor? The moment when discipline might finally give way to panic? When the shadow of the Allia, that nightmare a century earlier when the Celts sacked and burned Rome, rose again to haunt every soldier in the line? Would Telamon become another humiliation, another scar carved into Roman memory for generations? Up on a ridge, though, Lucius Aemilius Pappus didn't move. He sat tall on his horse, his face unreadable, a statue against the chaos. To the legionaries below, straining under the roar of Celtic triumph, it must have looked like hesitation. To the Celts, it might even have seemed like weakness. The Romans frozen, leaderless, paralyzed by fear, But Pappus was no fool. He had seen battles turn in a single heartbeat, seen men break when their commanders rushed headlong into disaster. He knew that if he lunged too soon, chasing glory like his fallen colleague, the entire Roman line could unravel. But what was he waiting for? He was waiting for the right alignment, the moment when his army could strike as one, when every Roman sword and shield would move like a single machine. Rome's strength was not in wild charges or the fury of individuals, but in discipline, in the iron bond that held the legion together. Then, at last, Pappus gave the order. The signal horn cut through the din. Roman infantry, line after line, lowered their spears, locked shields, and began to press forward in steady, grinding rhythm. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't wild. It was the slow, relentless pressure of a wall of men advancing shoulder to shoulder. And that wasn't all. On his command, the cavalry split off, not into the chaos of the center, but sweeping wide around the enemy's flank. The ground shook beneath hooves, the arc widening like a great steel tide, bending around the edges of the field. Like the jaws of a trap snapping shut, Rome's cavalry aimed not at breaking the front, but at sealing every road of escape. Pappus was setting the stage for Rome's signature play, the hammer and the anvil, where one force pins the enemy in place and the other smashes them from behind. And then came the Gay. They were the shock troops of the tribes, hired mercenaries who prided themselves on terror itself being their weapon. They charged without armor, their bodies bare but for tattoos, amulets, and a round shield gripped in one hand. The Celts believed that fighting naked showed fearlessness, that it proved their contempt for death and the protection of the gods. They burst forward, shrieking, their pale bodies gleaming in the afternoon sun, muscles painted with sweat and blood. Imagine standing in the Roman line and seeing that wave of naked fury rushing at you. The sheer shock of it was meant to unnerve even hardened veterans. For a moment, you can almost hear the intake of breath among the legionaries, that half-second where the human mind weighs fear against discipline. But Rome was built on discipline. Shields locked, lines held. The order was given and javelins darkened the sky. The first rank of Gaulish went down in heaps, bodies skewered mid-stride. Those who closed the distance slammed into a wall of shields, their wild swings glancing off bronze and iron. What they thought would be theatre turned into slaughter. Fury shattered against the Roman machine. Meanwhile, the larger Celtic host was now living a nightmare. On one side, they strained against Pappus's advancing legions. On the other, they had to face the battered but unbroken forces of Regulus, now steeled by the shock of their consul's death and driven on by his officers. The Celts fought hard, but every heartbeat tightened the Roman grip. Slowly, relentlessly, the jaws of the trap closed until the tribes found themselves not the hunters, but the hunted, penned in with nowhere to run. What had started as a contest of strength turned into slaughter. And this was the moment, the pivot where everything turned. The hammer and anvil came together, and the Celtic host was broken. The trap finally snapped shut. The Celtic line buckled, then fractured, then dissolved into panic. Men threw down shields, dropped weapons, and turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. Every road was blocked by Roman formations. Every hill was a wall of disciplined steel. Horses thundered over the fleeing, hooves crushing bodies and wagons alike. Those wagons weren't empty either. They carried families, children stumbling in the dust, women clinging to oxen, all swept into the vortex of panic. Screams pierced the air, blending with the clash of swords and the cries of dying warriors. The plunder they had brought, silver, bronze, treasure from towns they had already sacked, spilled into the dirt, glinting mockingly in the sun. Even their bold, fearless mercenaries, the grisly, who had fought naked to intimidate the Romans, were thrown into disarray, bodies scattered, some skewered on spears, others trampled beneath the relentless advance of Roman discipline. In the middle of it all was Breno, not the legendary Brennus of old, but a flesh-and-blood warrior, the kind who carried a spear and the memory of his people's pride. Surrounded by corpses and the thunder of Roman boots, he did the only thing left. He dropped to the ground and feigned death, lying still among the fallen while the slaughter raged over him. That's how close the killing was. So close you could smell the iron in the air, so close that survival meant pretending you were already a corpse. When the dust settled, the price was staggering. Tens of thousands of Celts lay dead, sprawled across the hills and valleys of Telamon. Their leaders, proud men who had once dreamed of challenging Rome, were dragged off in chains, their fate sealed. What had begun as a bold show of strength, a gamble to intimidate the Republic, ended in total ruin. Cisalpine Gaul, that stubborn thorn in Rome's northern frontier, was gutted. Its power broken, its villages and fortresses either burned or captured. The road to Roman dominance of northern Italy now lay open, unchallenged, and the consequences went far beyond the battlefield. With Telamon, the great Celtic threat in Italy was finally extinguished. No longer would war bands descend from the Po Valley, confident in their audacity and expecting Rome to flinch. Rome had not only won a battle, it had secured its northern frontier, sending a message to friend and foe alike. This was a republic that could not be broken. The shadow of past humiliations, the ghosts of Allia, had finally been exorcised. From this day forward, it was the Celts who had reason to tremble. For Rome, the victory carried a deeper meaning. The shadow of the Allia, that nightmare a century earlier when the Celts had burned the city itself, was finally banished. Telamon became a symbol of how Rome's political system and its armies could work in lockstep, how discipline could grind down even the wildest courage. It showed that Rome could take a deadly, unpredictable threat, a mass of warriors driven by ferocity and tradition, and methodically turn it into a trap, crushing it without losing its nerve. The battle wasn't just a military success, it was a strategic turning point. By decisively breaking the power of the boy in Subres and Gaisati, Rome neutralized the Celtic threat in northern Italy, opened the Po Valley to expansion, and sent a clear message to every neighboring tribe. Rome was organized, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. It was proof that Rome didn't just win battles through bravery, but through organization, foresight, and the uncanny ability to turn danger into opportunity. And here's the lasting twist. After Telamon, it wasn't Rome that trembled at the thought of Celtic warbands. No, from that day forward, it was the Celts who began to fear Rome, and northern Italy would never again be a safe corridor for their raids. A few decades later, the embers of these old grudges would flare once more, this time in a way that would reshape Italy's history entirely. Their paths would cross again under the shadow of new enemies, new strategies, and a figure who would leave his own mark on the Italian peninsula, Hannibal. But before we get there, take a moment and think about Telamon. Which moment hit you hardest? Was it the clash of swords, the roar of the Gaiatai, or that heartbeat when Regulus fell? Drop a comment and let us know. Your thoughts shape the conversation and the story we tell together. And if you've been following this journey through history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you won't miss the next chapter. We've got more battles, more strategy, and more of the human drama that makes history come alive. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.